This is the Unit 4 review. It's all about maritime empires that dominated the world between 1450 to 1750. This is also the unit where Europe basically dominates the world. Europe engages in this practice of colonialism and colonizes the New World. That's the main focus of this unit. So maritime empires are in stark contrast to land-based empires like the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, which were Muslim empires that we talked about in Unit 3. Maritime empires, as the name suggests, navigated the ocean, and through their navigation of the ocean came across to dominate the world. An empire, just so we're all on the same page, is a state or some kind of political authority that dominates the foreign and domestic policies of another political entity. Here's the Princeton Review pages that you can read to supplement your understanding of Unit 4. I expect you to be doing this, especially if you want that 5. The first thing that we're going to talk about in this unit is revolutions in European thought and expression. And so just to give you some context, in the Middle Ages, the history of the Middle Ages was dominated by local issues, a concern with, salvation, territorial disputes, disease and famine, limited access to publication, and basically small-scale trade. The political system there and social system and economic system, I should say, political, social, and economic system was the feudal system, which we talked about developed into more modern states. Governments started to centralize control and power. The Crusades actually had a profound effect on revolutions in European thought and expression. Although Christians were largely unsuccessful in the Crusades, they came into contact with Islamic empires, advanced Islamic empires that had preserved Greek and Roman texts. They came into contact with these, and this revitalized an interest in ancient Greek and Roman thought, which kickstarted the Renaissance, which is literally rebirth of ancient Greek and Roman thought in some ways. Europeans were surprised with how much human affairs and worldly affairs were considered in ancient Greek and Roman texts. This was in sharp contrast to medieval Europe, where thoughts of salvation and the afterlife dominated European thought. Nobody really thought about the here and now. If you were poor, you especially didn't want to think about the here and now. Your life was miserable. With the reintroduction of these texts, the Renaissance was marked by humanism, which is a focus on human endeavors. I'll show you a couple of humanistic paintings in the next couple of slides. I will say, however, the Catholic Church was still a dominant political force in Europe at this time, and so they often were patrons of these humanistic arts and artists. So they still had a lot of political power. Just because humanism became a more prominent style and idea did not mean that the Catholic Church went away. Last point I forgot to say is that the Renaissance really kickstarts in Italy and then spreads throughout Europe. In the left-hand side, you can see two famous paintings by the painter Raphael in the Stanza della Signatura, which is the papal palace in the Vatican. The one on the top left-hand corner is the School of Athens, which I want to talk more about. The School of Athens shows classical Greek and Roman figures, Greek philosophers in Plato and Aristotle, which are blown up on the right-hand corner. You can see Plato and Aristotle talking side by side, and it kind of almost apotheosizes them. It kind of exalts them, gives them more higher status than they might have seen in the medieval period, because remember, in the medieval period, it was all about religion and the church. So Raphael paints this in the Pope's apartments, in the papal apartments, so this is a significant development. He paints this, which is kind of like an ode, a song to human knowledge at the time, which was believed to be embraced by like philosophy, poetry, etc. So one of the reasons why I wanted to show you Raphael's paintings was because I wanted to note that, first of all, they're in the papal palace, right? And so these paintings are paid for by the church. So the church is a very huge patron of the art, the artwork, the Renaissance artwork that is getting produced in this time period. And I would also like to note that although humanism seems in tension with the Catholic Church, and with medieval religion, which it very much was, the church was still very dominant. And Raphael does, in fact, paint a theological image, as you can see at the bottom left-hand corner of a Christian image that is opposite of the School of Athens painting that he painted. So theology is still very much important in this time period. Here's some other famous Renaissance artwork, obviously with Da Vinci. Da Vinci drew the middle figure. There was this obsession with proportionality, with painting humans as realistically as possible in the Renaissance period. And then on the very right-hand side, Michelangelo's paintings in the Sistine Chapel, emphasizing the same things and ideas that I talked about when I showed Raphael's paintings. So the next big intellectual transformation in Europe at this time is the Protestant Reformation, and one technology instrumental in this was the printing press. Before the printing press, books were hard to produce, and therefore a lot of people were illiterate, and books were often only produced in Latin, which was the language of scholars in the Catholic Church. With the printing press, books were more widely produced. A lot more people became literate and demanded more and more books. In addition to this, books were printed in vernacular, so native languages like German or French. So this helped standardize languages, and it led to fewer changes between languages. So this actually is a development that we'll talk about in the next unit. The printing press basically helps contribute to nationalism. We'll talk about nationalism in Unit 5 and 6. Obviously, religion is still all the rave, so books and the printing of books often took the form of the Bible. So now people all of a sudden had Bibles in their vernacular language, and so this led to people being more willing to interpret it instead of taking what the Catholic Church said as law. The excerpt on the very right-hand corner is a excerpt from a New York Times article on nationalism and Benedict Anderson's definition of it as nationalism as an imagined community. We'll talk about that again, but just keep that in mind. So that's basically like a preview. So if one man started the Protestant Reformation, then it was definitely Martin Luther. In 1517, he was a German monk that nailed 95 theses on a church door. His 95 theses supposedly outlined his frustrations with current church practices, including the church's practice of selling indulgences, which he said amounted to selling salvation for profit. So basically, the church sold, in exchange for indulgence, people were guaranteed heaven, so they had to pay for heaven. You can see all kinds of other figures that break with the Catholic Church as well. Martin Luther really starts it, but other people use it as an opportunity to break with the Catholic Church and challenge the Catholic Church's political power. Of course, the Pope was very upset with Martin Luther. Martin Luther was protected by German noblemen against the Church's desire to arrest Martin Luther. The Catholic Church launched the Counter-Reformation in response to the Protestant Reformation. So if some of you are lost on what is the Protestant Reformation, just think of it as like a split between Christianity. Here's a history of Christianity, an evolution of Christianity. So obviously we're not too concerned with the Christianity becoming legal in 313 CE because our class starts at the year 1200, but Christianity becomes legal in the Roman Empire in 313 CE after being persecuted under the Romans, kind of ironically, and then Christianity later becomes the major religion of the Roman Empire. There's a great schism that leads to a split between Orthodox and the Catholic Church, and then in the 1500s, a schism between the Catholics and the Protestants. The Protestants usually emphasizing individual interpretation of the Bible and at odds with the Catholic Church's power. The Protestants also upset with a lot of the corrupt practices of the Catholic Church. Predictably, the Protestant and Catholic Reformation led to a variety of wars. I want to talk about now on the third bullet point. It talks about the 30 Years' War. I think you can do the reading on your own. But I want to talk about the Holy Roman Empire because it's a little bit complicated, and I also suggest that you also read page 207 to 209 in your Princeton review. But the Holy Roman Empire, which is kind of like the locus of conflict between Catholics and Protestants in Europe, really is kind of like a hot mess. So the three things you have to know about the Holy Roman Empire besides the hot mess, which I would say go back and read so you know, were that it lost parts of Hungary to the Ottoman Turks in the early 16th century. The 30 Years' War devastated the region and significantly weakened the role of the Holy Roman emperors, leading to the rise of hundreds of nation states in the region in the 19th century. And then by the 18th century, the northern German city-states, especially Prussia, were gaining momentum and power. So the Peace of Westphalia, which ends the 30 Years' War, enshrines or develops this idea of sovereignty, freedom from external control. It gives German states, so to speak, more power than they are normally used to. Usually they're used to getting directives from the Catholic Church, from religious authorities. It enshrines this principle of the state as being independent from those religious authorities, so to speak. It doesn't enshrine necessarily, but it develops that idea. I'm going to include a video or some type of link in the description on the Holy Roman Empire, so please watch or read it. So this is what you have due Monday. So I want to just make sure before I give you the hints and explain why we're doing this. So when we're writing a document-based question essay, which is going to be the essay that is going to define whether you get college credit for this course or not, you are reading the documents first, and then you're making an argument based on the prompt. You make a big argument. That big argument is called a thesis, right? Where you talk about all you're going to talk about in, or you're going to argue, I should say, in the essay. A thesis is like a roadmap, right? You can even say, I'm going to argue X, Y, and Z in your thesis in college, and in this class as well. From that thesis, you divide it up into mini arguments, right? Not because you have to, but because it's more manageable. And when you're talking about creating different body paragraphs, you'll have a topic sentence. That topic sentence usually is a short excerpt from your thesis, right? And a topic sentence is the first sentence in your body paragraph. It's a short excerpt from a thesis. So you can imagine that my thesis has something to say about the Protestant Reformation leading to European elites questioning the authority of the Catholic Church. And my thesis has more to say too, but I break my thesis into chunks so that way I can talk about them in different body paragraphs and make them more manageable. Then I would talk about documents, right, that support this thesis. I would use and integrate and explain how the documents that I summarize support this thesis. You also have to source at least two documents to realistically pass the AP exam. Sourcing a document is basically either analyzing the document, calling bull on documents that frankly disagree with what you're arguing, or you think that maybe the speaker has some suspect motives, or maybe the purpose of the document is to kind of try to hide something or something like that. To call bull on those documents because you're trying to make an argument, a historical argument, or to add context to those documents, make those documents, bring them to life, add context to them, explain the historical context of those documents. This can make the document more supportive of your argument, or to make the, for instance, if I wanted, or to make the speaker more credible, if I wanted to make sure that that document supported my topic such argument. For instance, if I thought it was necessary to make Martin Luther more credible to support my topic sentence argument, I might say that describe the occasion and soap, describe the historical context of what's going on, and explain how Martin Luther is talking from the perspective as someone enraged and angry, it seems genuinely, by the abuses of the Catholic Church. Martin Luther seems to be talking from a more genuine perspective. Yeah, he uses a lot of heavy language in his speech, but he seems to be genuine. He seems to be talking from, and this is where you're getting more at the S in soap, right? He seems to be talking as a concerned person, a concerned I guess, uh, Christian. So, giving the historical context of the document, explaining how the Catholic Church prior to the Protestant Reformation, was very corrupt, it seems, was very abusive of its power over people's lives for monetary gains in the sale of indulgences, would help contextualize the document and is considered sourcing and makes that, if you say in document, it makes that document more credible and you can use it to further your argument. Also remember, I want you to start including specific and relevant pieces of outside information in. There's so many different ways you could do this. I think that if you're talking about the occasion of a document, um, that's kind of close to specific and relevant pieces of outside information, but you would only get 1 point, right? You don't get double the points, right? Because if the occasion is similar to integrating specific and relevant outside information, meaning that you add context, you can't get both points, right? So you have to do the occasion and explain how talking about the occasion, the historical context, makes that document more credible and makes your argument more powerful. And then after that, I want you to put maybe a specific fact, and maybe you can, um, you know, link that specific fact, or you should link that specific fact to your argument. So what I'm thinking of is like maybe a specific, um, result from this. You can talk about the 30 Years' War as a specific fact that explains how the Protestant Reformation led to a series of wars in the Holy Roman Empire. You could talk about um, other things I would imagine, they're just not coming to me. Maybe you could talk about a specific date when the Catholic Counter Reformation starts. That's considered specific and relevant pieces of information that aren't found in the documents, and you need two of those. We've talked about the Enlightenment. We'll talk about the Enlightenment again in the next couple of units. But the Enlightenment, um, one of the is really just an intellectual movement, and one of the main um, political philosophical ideas that develops the Enlightenment that has ramifications that we'll learn more about in the next couple of units is the idea of the social contract. So remember, people and theorists like Thomas Hobbes and then later John Locke, they were trying to come up with an idea of how a state or government came into being. And they theorized, which was incorrect, they theorized that a long time ago people entered into a social contract because life without a government authority was nasty, brutish, and short. And this makes intuitive sense. I think life without the United States government would be horrible. The United States government does a lot of things for us. But the social contract probably did not take place. You can go back into the Unit 1 video to see how states actually developed. And by states, I mean um, the monopoly on the legitimate use of coercive violence, how more centralized governments developed. Go back to the Unit 1 video that I prepared for you. But the social contract isn't interesting for those reasons. The social contract is interesting because of its effect on politics, right? Because before, people believed that monarchs received their right to rule from God, the divine right to rule. And if suddenly the Enlightenment thinkers, Enlightenment political philosophers are saying, no, that's not the case, it was really a social contract where the people gave government power to protect their rights, suddenly um, that implies the right to replace or overthrow your government. So this wouldn't have any immediate impact, um, you know, now, right? We'll talk about this in Unit 5 and Unit 6, so just put a pin in it, but obviously you see where we're going. The last major intellectual development that actually also bleeds into the next unit when we talk about the Industrial Revolution in Europe is the Scientific Revolution. So science, just so I get it straight, is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical natural world through observation and experiment. Observation and experiment is key. The scientific revolution was marked by a lot of developments in physics, Newton's law, developments in astronomy, Copernicus, sorry, Copernicus came up with a heliocentric model of the universe. So previously, people thought that the universe revolved around the Earth, and now suddenly there was a conception that no, at least our solar system revolves around the sun. There were also all kinds of other developments. Science is such an influential activity today, right? The scientific method is studied in so many disciplines, and it's used in so many disciplines to acquire and refine knowledge. It comes from this time period. I'm studied political science, I guess you could say, and economics, and both use the scientific method. Both talk about observation and experiment. So when we're talking about, um, uh, or both use observation and experiment as a means of acquiring knowledge and explaining the world, right? So when we're talking about the scientific method, we're not just talking about like chemists and I guess biologists, something so to speak. We're talking about an intellectual activity, right? A practical activity that has influenced thinking to this very day. It's amazing. So currently I'm reading, well, I'm not going to get into what I'm reading, but if you want to talk about what I'm reading, then please talk about what I'm reading. So those are developments that take place in Europe. And I know it seems a little disjunctured from what is going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about, but colonialism is going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about, is particularly European colonialism. Um, and basically, Europe dominates the world. And that has had ramifications on how the world has turned out pretty much ever since. So, colonialism is a practice of domination which involves the subjugation of one people to another. Colonialism is kind of like a branch of imperialism, but colonialism usually involves settlers. You can read through the slide to see the etymology of the word colonialism. Colonialism, I think we can all agree, was super horrible. It led to the death and subjugation of millions of people. It also led to the uh, extraction of different and abuse of different resources, including labor and capital. Um, so I included a link below, a Washington Post article talking about colonialism and its effect on the world today. Um, we are going to talk and compare new imperialism with colonialism that takes place after Columbus in 1492, sailed the ocean blue type colonialism, because I think comparing them might be the DBQ on your AP test. We'll do that over the next 2 weeks, and we'll probably do that in discussion section. These are all kinds of innovations that led to the establishment of maritime empires, the magnetic compass, the astrolabe, etc. So go ahead and look through this list. The three G's becomes the motivations for European exploration in the New World: God, gold, and glory. We've all learned that for a while. The DBQ that you'll have to turn in Friday asks to what extent um, does economic factors contribute to that? So maybe the acquisition of gold. Also, you have to think other resources, right? Gold is also a metaphor for other resources, or not a metaphor, a symbol for other resources, such as cash crops, etc. Also, if you come away from this just knowing two vocabulary words, know colonialism and mercantilism. So, mercantilism is also a huge influential ideology in world history. It's an economic ideology. Remember, an ideology is an action oriented system of belief. It was a belief that the only true measure of a country's wealth and success was the amount of gold that it had. If one country had more gold than another, it was believed to be better off. Mercantilists believed a country should be maximize their exports and minimize the imports. You can see the logic of that there. The mercantile ideology was zero sum. It was a zero sum view of the world. So it means nothing could be win win. Everything was win lose. So you had to maximize exports so you could win. Mercantile thinking has since been heavily questioned as and seen as kind of dumb by more modern economists, and even just economists like or great thinkers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo that supersede them or supersede that critique mercantilism. Um, they kind of turn this idea that that the world was a zero sum game on its head. Smith, for example, showed that real national wealth doesn't come from amassing piles of gold. Wealth comes from increasing productivity. That is by figuring out how to make stuff more efficiently, which permanently increases living standards. How do you do this? You specialize in what you do well and hone your skills in that area. Then you trade with other people who do other stuff well. Through these transactions over time, everyone gets richer. So Smith shows how international trade can actually be a good thing. Mercantilism says that that can be very bad, that you should maximize exports and try to amass gold. So yeah, you should see an article that talks about Trump's trade policies below from the Washington Post and compares it to mercantile thinking. Mercantile thinking also kind of was a motive for imperialism because colonies, or colonialism as well, because colonies could provide you with gold and silver. If they didn't do that, at least they could provide you with like foodstuffs or raw materials that you can convert and send um, and export, and you can amass greater and greater wealth, or you can use to feed your machine. This slide talks about specifically the Portuguese and their trading post empires. I would read through every slide that I give you, but the most important fact in here is that the Portuguese Empire was a trading post empire, meaning it was built more on like establishing minor trading posts, particularly on the coast, the African coast, um, because they just simply didn't have enough people and they couldn't penetrate Africa very effectively. I would go through these slides. They're just going to appear on your screen fast, but they just kind of section off and go into like early French, Spanish, English exploration, and then the impact of those voyages. So this is one of the major topics. You obviously had this essay topic on your semester exam. The Columbian Exchange is often very tested, or you can often integrate the Columbian Exchange into your response. So just remember that the Columbian Exchange really is talking about history from an ecological perspective, from an environmental perspective, and that's impact. It's talking about the spread of germs and diseases and the impact of that and the spread of food and animals. So, because Native Americans were isolated from Europeans and people in Eurasia, they really had not built immunities to the diseases that the Europeans brought to them in 1492, so after Columbian contact. So, a lot of them died from smallpox, etc. That's one of the major impacts of the Columbian Exchange, right? It pretty much decimates the Native American populations and allows Europeans to dominate and colonize. The spread of animals or the exchange of animals and food. Europeans introduced horses to the New World, which did not exist in the New World, and food. The Europeans bring wheat to the New World, and the native, especially in central Mexico, give Europeans maize, which becomes corn. So that's another exchange. So when the Spanish come to the New World, they're looking in search of gold. They have that mercantile logic. The Portuguese, on the other hand, are begin to, while they're in the New World, cultivate sugar. Um, they realize that sugar cultivation could be profitable. You could sell it, and then you can make a profit. Um, this switch after the Spanish or the other European explorers in the New World and colonists focus on cash crop cultivation has a huge impact. This requires a more and more labor. Um, Although the Europeans did enslave or create social and economic hierarchies that basically enslaved natives. Natives were in short supply. Also, there was criticism about how the Spaniards treated the natives. So there was a turn for another source. That source was slavery, African slavery. So African slavery um, develops from this need to cultivate um, crops in the New World. This is due Tuesday before midnight. The source or the document is from um, a uh, Mexican anthropologist who recreates. I think he takes oral stories from Aztec-speaking people and kind of explains the Aztec perspective. So the way you can source this document is different ways. The Mexican anthropologist is still living, but you should take this document as being more from the point of view of the Aztec people. So do it. So now I'm going to go more into depth about how the empires of European states were established in the period 1450 to 1750 and what economic and labor systems fueled them. So trading posts were set up in Africa by the Portuguese and then other European powers after Prince Henry the Navigator traveled around Africa. Some African rulers realized there was a military advantage to exchange guns for slaves and grew wealthy. So they helped, were complicit in the slave trade. They bought guns and exchanged slaves. You can see Europeans in West African art, which depicts Europeans as intruders. Um, the Asante Empire and the Kingdom of the Congo grew in influence after trade with Europe. The Portuguese take over ports of the Swahili coast through the African region into long-term decline. Japan tolerated the Christian missionaries, sorry, I should say, that came from the Portuguese and Dutch traders until the influence of Christianity grew too strong. We talked about the Tokugawa shogunate in Unit 3, basically shutting off itself from outside influence. The Ming Dynasty in China was very ethnocentric. They believed they were superior to the rest of the world, that is to say, they prohibited foreign trade. They developed an isolationist perspective like Japan and destroyed dockyards and limited the size of ships. Obviously, the growth of maritime trade resulted in the growth of European rivalries. One such rivalry took place in India. So at first, the British East India Joint Stock Company traded with the Mughal Empire. They focused originally on trade, but then they started focusing on attaining and consolidating political power. The really fascinating thing, as a side note, is that joint stock companies, which are basically private corporations, um, are private. Think of it like the British East India Joint Stock Company as like Google taking over a country. It's like a corporation essentially taking over a country. So look at the Financial Times article that I included in the description. But India was one place where the British, the Portuguese, and the French all fought and vied for power. To settle rivalry, sometimes there were diplomatic efforts, like the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which essentially divides the New World in two. And everything to the left of the line that you see was supposed to be given to the Spanish, and everything to the right, the Portuguese. Obviously, the Portuguese didn't know how much the Spanish would be getting because they still lacked knowledge of North America and South America. And so it seems like a bad deal now in retrospect. But yeah, this is just an important fact. So this is a slide about Europe and the Americas. We'll talk about the conquest of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Incan empires in the next slide, which are huge important facts in EP world history. Um, the Spain versus Portugal, we already talked about it. They divided the New World. Today, Brazil, which was colonized by the Portuguese, speaks Portuguese, obviously, and most of most of South America and Mexico speaks Spanish. So those are just some legacies of colonialism. France and Great Britain fought for control over North America. So natives initially sided with Britain in North America, but the powerful Iroquois eventually switched to the French side. Great Britain pushed France out of um, the New World with the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War, because the French and Indians fought on the same side. I'm sorry, they didn't push France out of the New World. They dislodged France from Canada. France still had possessions in the New World that eventually goes away as well for different reasons. Two major events in AP world history are the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire and the Spanish conquest of the Incan Empire. So Pizarro's forces grabs Atahualpa. We talked about how they set up a trap for him. We read an excerpt from Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I'll show in the next slide, and that's on the right-hand side of the image. And then the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire is on the left-hand side of the image. I want you to incorporate, these would be good examples of specific and relevant information that you can incorporate into a DBQ if it asks about like the consequences of European colonialism in the New World, or the consequences of, or the maybe the motives of European colonialism in the New World. You could talk about how Cortez in, was enthralled with gold, etc. So this is an excerpt from Guns, Germs, and Steel that we read way at the beginning of the year, and talks about the immediate reasons for Pizarro's success over the Incan Empire, and it was basically guns, steel, and germs. Germs greatly weakened the Incan Empire as they weakened the Aztec Empire when Cortez conquered the Aztecs. Answer this multiple choice question and explain the connection. This multiple choice question is really just to, I want you to understand how sophisticated the political systems were in the New World, and that the Europeans were able to, I guess, conquer them because of a series of different reasons related to the Columbian Exchange, predominantly the spread of infectious diseases. The search for silver and gold drove exploration because of the mercantile thinking that existed in this time period. The discovery of silver in Mexico and Peru proved a horrible development for indigenous people. Europeans needed labor, so they often forced indigenous people to work. So the Europeans developed coercive labor systems to put indigenous people to work. In the New World, it took uh, the encomienda system um, was a it was a grant of indigenous peoples to a Spaniards known as an encomendero. And the indigenous peoples had to give the encomendero tribute and labor services in exchange for which the encomendero was charged with converting them to Christianity. I think if there's a DBQ about the motives of European colonialism, you could say that there are seemingly two motives based on that fact. It seems to be like a conversion to Christianity motive and then an economic motive. But I think you can also say and give a sense of an extent. I think the economic motive comes across as more strong, and the Christianity motive, like, oh, you have to convert them to Christianity, is more like, let's justify the brutality and the horrible things that we're doing to indigenous people. Around 1545, silver was discovered in the Incan Empire, famously at Cerro Rico, the rich hill. Around it grew the city of Potosi, which at its height in 1650 had a population of 160,000 people. Um, to exploit the silver, however, the Spanish needed miners, a lot of miners. So they um, re- revived and adapted an Incan labor institution known as the Mita, which in the Incas language means a turn. Under their Mita system, the Incas had used forced labor to run plantations designed to provide food for temples, the aristocracy, and the army. In return, the Inca elite provided famine relief and security. So the Spanish used an existing institution, and they used it to exploited it so that that way they can extract resources from silver mines. Um, and it became an extractive institution. Uh, Eventually, however, indigenous people were dying in droves, so Europeans needed a new source of labor, so slavery from Africa became a thing, I guess. Not I guess, it did become a thing, but sorry, I'm just very tired. One prominent critic of European the Europeans' encomienda system specifically was Bartholomew de las Casas, who wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies. He's very critical. You could cite him. You might see him appear as one of your documents on a DBQ, etc. So just remember his name and know that he was a prominent critic that criticized the encomienda system. So here the topic centered argument seems to be at odds with what the document is saying. And so one of the great things about SOAP analysis and sourcing a document is that you can use it to discredit the document. So think about the speaker. Is he a credible source? Or the occasion or the purpose of this document really? I would focus on either the speaker or the purpose of this document because ultimately you want to depreciate uh, uh, depreciate the credibility of this document so that way your argument stands out. It's always good to know what the commercial revolution is. Also, the rise of joint stock companies during this period is hugely important. Joint stock companies kind of represent early corporations. It was a highly innovative financial instrument. It allowed people to pool their wealth together. So, in the same way that I can buy a share in Google today and don't run a lot of risks. Like if Google suffers a lot of losses, I don't run necessarily a lot of risk because I could spread the shares in companies or shares I own in companies. Joint stock companies were the same way. They also allowed people to pool a lot of resources together and therefore embark on these journeys. So stock companies were a hugely important financial instrument. The triangular trade from this period refers to the trade that took place across the Atlantic. Predominantly, African slaves were transported to the Americas via the Middle Passage. Raw goods were sent to Europe, and manufactured goods were sent to the Americas in keeping with mercantile thinking. You can see all the different vectors and what was um, sent. This is just a section on how do people respond to European colonialism, and Europeans going across the world demanding trade or political power or territory. Here you can see Metacom's War, the Pueblo Revolt, all very fascinating challenges to state power in the Americas. I don't want to necessarily explain what you can read. You can read the AMSCO textbook sections about these. They're hugely important, and they very well could be tested. So make sure you know them. But I want to get you started on the document-based question. The document-based question will be a major summative that I need by the end of day on Friday. You will have to write your contextualization and thesis paragraph to me by Thursday. These DBQs, I only want you to spend 45 minutes on them. Even if they're really horrible, I still want you to turn it in and use the honor system. Say you spend 45 minutes on it, so I will give you full credit, but I need to see improvement each and every week, right? To be able to continue to give you full credit even if your essays aren't great. So 45 minutes is you're timing yourself. You can use open book, open resources. You better not lift passages directly off the different resources. Focus on analyzing the document, building analysis, etc. You can spend 10 minutes on the thesis and the contextualization. That's how much I would spend on the real test. That's probably a little heavy. Probably you'll need 5 minutes to read the documents. And then turn that in, and then spend 30 minutes on Friday writing the body paragraphs. This is your DBQ. It's basically analyze the extent to which the motives for European exploration were economic, so I would also include other motives. Obviously, this is an AP test. Include other motives, talk about religious motives like converting to Christianity, and make sure you're sticking to European colonialism in the 15th century, right, in the 16th century, because that's what they're referring to in the documents. Read the documents first, then develop your argument, etc. Include outside evidence, and we'll talk about the rubric. I'm sorry, we've talked about the rubric, but we'll talk about it again at discussion sections on Friday. I hope you guys enjoy discussion sections because it allows me to also make work and life easier for you during the week. And I like seeing you guys.